Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the book Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment by Daniel Kahneman, Olivier Sibony, and Cass R. Sunstein. You may remember Daniel Kahneman from he's the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talked about the psychological biases people have and how they affect decision-making. And sort of that part of his research and work, I think, was tied into him winning the Nobel Prize. You know, no big deal. Olivier Sibony, don't know that guy. I think he's bringing the math part into this book of the trio. And Cass R. Sunstein wrote another one of my favorites, which is called Nudge. And that is about how we make decisions and influence the decisions of others around us. So sort of stacked deck of three great authors came together to write this kind of massive book. And it is fascinating. It's a little bit technical. Throw a party right now if you love statistics. And if you don't love statistics, you might love them by the end. But this book really gets into the heart of why a statistical analysis of how we make decisions, human judgment, as they would say, is going to take us really far toward making better judgments. And of course, because they're all very smart authors, they have to define everything in a little bit particular and specific way. And so by judgment, what they mean is any measurement in which the instrument is a human mind. I know, sounds a little esoteric. That's what they say. So we're not meaning judgment like I judge you to be good or bad, or I judge this to be, awesome or not awesome. Judgment is a measurement in which the instrument is a human mind. So basically, the decisions we kind of make. And this book sets up a really great split between noise, the topic of this book, and bias. And we sort of conflate the two, or we can see bias. Bias is something that is, and by bias, of course, they're specific. They mean psychological biases. So bias is like the recency effect, where whatever we see last, we think is the most important or most meaningful. Or the sort of, I forget the name of this, creation effect. So the things we create, we give more value to than things that obviously intrinsically have more value, but because we created them, we think they're more valuable. So those are the types of biases they mean when they say bias. So we have bias and we have noise. And to explain what noise looks like, here's your fun introductory part of statistic land. If you know what a bell curve looks like, call one to your mind. If you don't know what a bell curve looks like, I will attempt to describe one for you with these amazing words. Basically, a bell curve is sort of like the cross-section side of a hill. There's an x-axis, a y-axis. The hill starts pretty shallow. It gets super steep, goes to a peak, pretty steeply down, and then sort of shallowly trails off at the end. And so this is a distribution curve of sort of random things that happen. I know that's not super meaningful to you, but if you imagine, if you try to assess the height of everyone who's 4 years old, there's going to be some that are very short, a lot of people kind of in this sort of middle range, and then some that are super tall. So we have this sort of distribution curve of heights of people of a certain age, for example. What they also have found is we have the same sort of distribution curve when we look at judgments, right? So when we look at measurements made by human minds, we also have a distribution curve. And this is, I think, when they described all of this, how I got the best picture of the difference between noise and bias. So if you imagine this distribution curve, this like big slope, most of the people are within one standard deviation of the middle of this curve, right? It's a very symmetrical curve in, the picture book version of it. And so most people are, I think, within one standard deviation. Someone is going to fact check me on this, but I think it's about 80 to 83% of people are pretty close to the middle. Less than 10% are on this far tailing end on either end. So less than 10% on either end are sort of these extremes. Most people pretty close to the middle. And where that middle line is, that's sort of, I don't know, it has some fancier name, but that's the goal, the point. That's where most things should be lying. Like the average is that sort of middle point there that divides this very symmetrical curve in half. So if you imagine that we are trying to look at judgments as a distribution curve, right? So if we have all the traffic tickets in a city, and we look at the speed people were going when they got a traffic ticket. Most of them are going to be probably around a certain number of miles per hour over the speed limit, for example. If you look at one traffic zone that has a 25 mile per hour speed limit, you might have this distribution curve of how fast people are going when they got a ticket. So let's say most people, I'm making these stats up, people, go do some Googling to find some distribution curves if you want. But let's say most people were going 40 miles per hour who got a ticket. Some maybe were only going 27 miles per hour, like very few. Some are going 70 miles per hour, very, very few. But most people are within this middle range of right around 40 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. They're going to be the people who get pulled over, get a ticket. Fantastic. We have this distribution along this line of things. Another place where you see this distribution curve is in hiring. Let's say you're a company and you want the average person to stay with your company for 5 years. That's your goal in hiring, 5 years with a company. That's our goal. And so you hire some people and they're with a company like 1 year. So they're on one end of the spectrum. And you hire, people you're pretty good at it. So most are in this 5 year range in the middle within a standard deviation, which might be a year, between 4 and 6 years. You're like, that's reasonably good. A little, things happen. And very few people are with a company, let's say 10 years. That's the other end of the spectrum. So you have this big swoopy line. Most people are near your average. You're doing a great job. Fantastic. But then if you want to overlay this sort of hiring curve, in terms of how long people are around with bias, let's say you have this hiring curve and you notice that within a certain group, let's say people who are under 25, they all are with the company only 2 years. And so their peak distribution is much lower, on the scale. If you overlap these two archy, swoopy lines, one has their peak at 5, another one has their peak at 2, and then they drop off pretty fast. They're with the company 2 years. It's not as even distribution curve. That shows like some bias. Like, when we hire younger people or whatever, they don't stick around long enough. That's a sort of an example of bias. But if you go back to the normal swoopy curve, you have this group of people who are all in the hiring process. And so a candidate comes in, they all do the interviews, everything is great. They look at and they all rate how long they think this person will be with the company. Like, I think it'll be 5 years. I think it'll be 4 years. I think it'll be 8 years, whatever it is. They all give their guess during the interview process, let's say. And then later you can go back and check, were they worth the company 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever it was. So you can look at the accuracy of each person on the hiring committee's guesses, essentially around how long the person's going to be with the company. And so those different guesses all around the same person, and these are all professionals. These are all people on the hiring committee and hiring part of the organization. If they are actually professionals and they're actually making judgments based on how long a person will be with a company, why don't they all have the same guess? I know, your brain's exploding right now. Well, they're different people, whatever. The reason that they don't have the same guess is, ta-da, the title of this book, noise. So when people who are making judgments, who should have the same judgment, end up with different judgments about something, that is noise. And there's sort of different types of noise within the system. So if you imagine 10 people on a hiring committee, they all interview someone, they each have guesses ranging from 1 year to 10 years for how long they think a person will be with the company. How do you have such a range among people who are all on the same committee, doing the same thing, hearing the same thing, in the same interview, whatever it is? So this is what noise is, this differentiation, this divergence in views of a same judgment. Like, they should be judging the same. They're looking at the same person. They're all professionals. You look at why. So when we're looking at why noise happens, there are different types of noise. There's different reasons it happens. But one of them is maybe people aren't clear on what they're supposed to be doing. They lack some training. They lack some education. They lack some piece of information that's going to be useful for them. So this training piece, maybe you have someone that just got on the committee yesterday and they are like, everyone has been here for 5 years. Well, this guy who's interviewing, I don't like the look of him. I think he's only going to be here 2 years, whatever. This woman I'm interviewing, she's brilliant. She just said, she reminds me of my mom. Fantastic. I think she'll be here 1,000 years. Great. So they maybe aren't making accurate judgments based on a couple different factors. So the reason we have noise within a system, there's a couple different reasons. There's system noise, which is this sort of inconsistency. And this inconsistency within the system damages the credibility of the entire system. There's this sort of classic example around when people are sentenced for certain crimes. why do two people with essentially the same background who essentially commit the same crime have very different sentences on the other end? This sort of noise between different judges, if you survey 20 judges, give them this case file, here's a person, here's their case, here's your whatever, they just read the case notes. How long would they, sentence this person for? You're going to find this bell curve. These are literal judges, literally trained in law, literally trained. This is their job, is to make these assessments based on like a jail sentence, for example, for a certain crime. The things like this. So this weird curve, this is noise. These are judges. They should know their job. They've all been around. If you survey judges who've all been around for 10 years, all judges who, like literal court judges who've all been around for 20 years, and you still ask them these same questions around how would you sentence this, how much jail time would you give for some random crime? You get this distribution curve. There is noise in the system, and that's system noise. And the system loses credibility. If one person can go to one judge one day and get a sentence for 2 years, and they go to a different judge, the exact same case, a different judge that happens to be assigned, and they get sentenced to 8 years, that's what noise is within the system. There's also level noise. And so this is the average level of judgments that are different between judges. So some judges, again, to use judges meaning court, judges, some are known to be really harsh judges, or some are known to be really lenient judges. So just knowing that about a judge creates this idea of level noise. And some people think all traffic tickets, you should have 2 years in jail for a traffic ticket. And I don't think any judge actually thinks that. This is wildly created example just for your own entertainment purposes to highlight noise. So if one judge thinks everyone who gets a traffic ticket should be in jail for 2 years, another judge thinks everyone who gets a traffic ticket should be left with a warning after they come into court and go about their business. Huge range, right? But this is what we see maybe between different levels of judges, because there's level variability. Some think that this crime is terrible and we should never have it. Some think it's fine. We don't, it's not that big a deal, perhaps. So you have noise within the system. And there's this other interesting part, which is pattern noise. So that's a judge's own variability within their judgments. They did these fascinating studies where judges were given the same case later. So they looked at, I think one of the examples they talked about is forensic scientists. And so they're trying to identify, fingerprints. They talk specifically about fingerprints. So the forensic scientists are reading fingerprints. They're supposed to match the fingerprint with a test fingerprint. So they're trying to match, fingerprints, right? To get a fingerprint match. Don't worry, they tell you a lot more detail about it, how it works in the book. And so they give someone these two, sets of fingerprints. Did they find a match? Yes, no, sort of. They have different sort of ratings for how a match happens, but I'm simplifying this for you folks. And so they did this test. They gave all these forensic scientists fingerprints. Did they match? Did they not? Whatever. And then they kept testing them on the same fingerprint pairs, or the same sets of fingerprints. And the same people later were like, first they were like, oh yeah, this is totally a match, no problem. Later they're like, oh no, these don't match at all. There is this weird amount of pattern noise. The same person came up with different judgments with the exact same evidence at a later time. So that's pattern noise. People are all over the place. And the third type of noise is occasion noise. And I think there has been some more popular studies about this pretty recently, where the occasion noise is the variability among unseen possibilities. You're like, well, I don't even know what this means. Well, basically, the occasion affects the judgment. And things like occasion could be the person's mood. If the judge is in a really good mood, they are actually more likely to let their bias alter their thinking, which is fascinating, right? Oh, and they're also more gullible, which is fascinating when you're in a good mood. But a person in a very positive mood, in a very good mood, might affect their judgment. They might be like, oh, it'll be fine, and not taking things as seriously, if you can imagine. Or an occasion noise might be like, oh, this judgment I'm having to make about sentencing this person who got a speeding ticket. Oh, they really remind me of my mom. Like, I wouldn't want to sentence my mom, and so the occasion of how this person happens to look affects how they form their judgment. They may be more lenient because they wouldn't sentence their mom to, 100 years in jail. So that occasion noise affects the judgment. And occasions could be time, could be place, could be, they did this really great study around sentencing in criminal courts based on time of day. So early in the morning, People got lower sentences. As they get closer toward lunch, their sentences got more harsh. Then there's a break for lunch. Sentences after lunch immediately were lower again, and then they get higher and higher toward the end of the day. And it is surmised that this is because as people get more tired, they are less open to being flexible in their thinking. Maybe they just want to get through the cases and get to lunch, get a sentence, move on, get a sentence, move on. So time of day affects how you are being judged, which is the occasion. It has nothing to do with you as a person. If you're the person being judged, it has nothing to do with your case, with anything like that. They've seen this distribution of sentencing that occurs directly related to time of day. The same thing, by the way, also happens with how likely you are to be prescribed opiates based on the time of day that you see your doctor. So earlier in the day, maybe the doctors have more time for you, they're sharp, they're on their game. People are less likely to be prescribed opiates. Late in the day, maybe they're behind schedule, maybe things are being rushed, maybe they're just excited to wrap things up and go for the day. You're way more likely to be prescribed opiates for the same type of condition, exclusively based on the time of day. So this is occasion noise. Why should this even be different? Why should the time of day matter? How you present yourself to your doctor, what she has to say about how your condition is being treated, how she decides for your plan of care. It's called noise, people. That's why. It's a mess. It makes you wonder, is the system even credible, right? That was their problem. This is the problem with noise, that we wonder about the credibility of systems when who we are randomly assigned as a judge, as a doctor, as a fingerprint, matcher, forensic scientist, who that person is affects outcomes a lot more greatly than we might think. And this is like sort of their other thesis. There's a ton of noise in the system and is way more prevalent than you even can imagine. So we have this noise, it's cruising along, everything's terrible. People, they're things that ramp up noise, increase the amount of noise in a system, and there are things that decrease it. So things that might ramp up or increase noise, one is very funny, it's just objective ignorance. And this is that there are relevant factors we don't know and can't know. Objectively, we can't know everything. When we assume we do, when we think we have all the information, we are in this state of denial of our objective ignorance. And that makes us make terrible judgments, by the way, and that adds to noise in the system. We think we've gotten all the facts. We don't. And we actually never can. So good luck with that. There's also a thing that increases noise are ambiguous scales. I don't know if you've ever had a survey or if someone ever asks you, hey, rate how great this, shirt looks on a scale of 1 to 10. And you're like, oh, that shirt's totally a 10. It's amazing. And someone else is like, oh, that shirt's totally a 6. It's amazing. You're like, well, wait, I thought 10 was amazing. 6 is amazing. We just have different scales. Numbers mean different things. It's ambiguous. What does a 10 shirt look like? What does a 6 shirt look like? Who even knows? Totally ambiguous scale. And so we can reduce noise, right? So noise is a mess. Oh, by the way, remember that bell curve we talked about? Where if we have this average in the middle and noise is that we have a distribution all over the place, bias might mean that the peak of our bell curve is at the wrong place. So if that's what bias means, and noise means that we're spread out all over the place, we should be all having the same decision, theoretically, in the same situation. Unless, more math, I know, hold on. Unless the bias point, so unless our peak of our average of all of our things is a whole standard deviation away from our average middle, that middle point of our curve. So unless we're biased by an entire standard deviation, fixing noise will reduce the amount of error in the system far more than fixing bias. So fixing noise will do more to reduce error in the system than fixing bias. And again, bias means psychological biases. Error means just having an incorrect judgment. Like, oh, hey, we think these people will be with the company for 5 years. They're with the company for 2 years. We're way off track here. And noise means that we are distributed all over the place when we should have consistent judgments based on the same consistent knowledge. So if we reduce noise, we do far more to reduce error than to reduce bias, unless bias is an entire standard deviation off, which is, as you may recall from my 5 seconds on what bell curves look like about 10 minutes ago. Standard deviation is huge. That means that you're off by 90%, right? So if 45%, I guess that's standard deviation is 42% or something like that, 41. I don't know. Look at your math. A standard deviation from your average is an enormous amount. Versus bias, which is that you're all spread out all over, so that's bias, means if you're a standard deviation off with bias, you are doing bad with bias. If you have a normal distribution bell curve, your noise is far worse than an entire standard deviation of bias. And until bias passes a standard deviation, noise is a far bigger source of error in your entire system, which again is going to destroy your system credibility, but also lead to these errors. Like you end up hiring people that are only with the company for 2 years. You end up giving sentencing that's like all over the place. And some people would say, they talk about this in the book, like, well, some are low, some are high, they average out in the end. Like, is that fair to say? Like, well, you know what? Because we gave the last person a 2-year court case, a 2-year jail sentence, we need to give you a 10-year jail sentence to average it out. No way is that fair. No way is that an equitable way to approach people and their lives. This is the problem of noise, right? They don't actually average out in the end. So how to get rid of noise is kind of important. There's replacing absolute judgments with relative ones, or basically kind of focusing on a scale, giving people some landmarks, understanding how are we actually making this judgment, right? What are we basing this on? How great this shirt is based on the color of the shirt? Are we looking at the cut of the shirt? Are we looking at how the shirt, how many washes before it fades? Who even knows? We need to standardize and make it relative. Like, oh, wait, shirt is 10% more faded after I wash it one time. This is a terrible shirt. This is a great shirt. Whatever it is. We try to standardize and make these things relative and knowable, understandable, the scale we're talking about. The other thing that they talk about for reducing noise, this crazy variability across judgments, is they have this term decision hygiene, which sounds not pleasant, but that's what it is. Get your hygiene on your decisions. You'll be fine. And so here are some tactics for decision hygiene, which is basically setting yourself up to make better decisions so you don't have this noisy, messy distribution all over the place. One is linear sequential unmasking. So this is a fancy way of saying you only know the necessary information at the time you need to know it, and you limit access to biasing information, including previous judgments. Like the more we know our previous judgment, the more we are likely to agree with ourselves or to agree with other people who have made a judgment. And so the less, objective, the less good we do, the less of a great job we do in making judgments. So linear sequential unmasking, knowing the necessary information, limiting access to biasing information. Another great decision hygiene strategy is selection, which means you pick the best judges. Oh, there's a shocking one. Get rid of terrible judges. Again, by judges, we mean people who are making measurements with the human mind. So who is really good at making decisions around hiring in our company? Who is actually really accurate at matching fingerprints? Who's really consistent and in line with what we all expect around sentencing? Some judges do better than others. Some are off the charts. Great. Pick the best judges. Pick the ones who give you the most consistent, most spot on, most average. I mean, that maybe is a weird thing to say, but answers that lack noise within themselves. Some people, super noisy. You ask them to match the same fingerprints the next week. It matches. It doesn't matches. It matches. It doesn't matches. They might be all over the place. Some people are probably just really good at being really consistent over time. I'm not even talking about the things we judge, by the way. When they talk about predictions, there's this whole other very funny side, not even side, chapters and chapters on if we're trying to make predictions, we don't actually know everything. We can't make good predictions. There are people paid to be predictors in various fields. Political predictions, is very popular. There's a great study on that. And people who are paid to make political predictions don't fare very well. Their predictions don't come true. They aren't super accurate. They're barely more accurate than chance. So there's not distinctly better than chance. They could flip a coin on every single one. All their predictions would be close enough. But there were some people that actually did a good job. For whatever reason, they got the right information. Oh, they talk about this, how they got the right information. They looked at other test cases. They looked at what averages are. They looked at base rates. They did things like this in order to ground their decision, their judgment, in sort of a standard reality. If you ask people to estimate how many jelly beans are in a big jar, for example, some people are going to be really accurate with that. Some people way off track. Some people might be like, well, cool, how many jelly beans are in this teenier jar over here? Like they might do find a base rate, find other information that's going to inform this decision. But speaking of the jelly beans in the jar, there is also aggregation is a great decision hygiene strategy. So this is combining an array of many independent judgments. And so key here, they have to be independent judgments. And if you combine them all, a huge number of people, you're going to probably get, on average, about the right amount in the end. If you're trying to, the average of all these people is going to be pretty accurate. So the example they talk about is that they had this big ox at a fair, and everyone had to guess the weight of the ox. I don't know how much an ox weighs. You could look at it, you poke, I don't know, what do you do to weigh an ox? And there were people guessed all over the place, like within 100 pounds, range. There's this bell curve of how big this ox is going to weigh. People were accurate, people were not accurate, whatever. But when they averaged all the answers together, they were within 2 pounds of the actual weight, which is crazy. To have 100 people, let's say, all make random guesses, the average of them is super spot on accurate because they're all independent. They had to write on their little piece of paper, throw it in the little barrel. No one knew what anyone else's judgment were, so they weren't biased. And they all just made their best guess, whatever it was. So back to the jelly beans in the jar. How can you aggregate answers in order to get a good answer? How can you make multiple guesses and average them together, essentially, that will bring you closer to the accurate answer, the average, the mean, like what the target you're shooting for than anything else. And it's super easy to do. Aggregation, fantastic. Again, though, your judges can't be biased by too much information, by having made the same guess more than once, because they will agree with themselves and they'll skew themselves. And they're noisy. Those were those noises I talked about. Types of noise, pattern noise, I think becomes really prevalent when you ask the same person to guess a couple times. So those are a few. The other decision hygiene strategy was guidelines. And so I know in some places in schools, they've moved to rubrics, right? Like there are specific guidelines, specific characteristics. We know what each standard means. It should be pretty obvious to look for signs of one thing, fit them in one category. If you're, for example, going to grade an essay, was proper punctuation used? Yes or no? Cool. That puts you at this level of the rubric. Were proper capitalization used? Yes or no? Great. That gives you points toward this other level. So you're really standardizing or offering guidelines so people know what different things mean. They know how to apply what they're seeing through this filter of guidelines and come up with a consistent judgment on the other end that lacks noise, or noise is minimized. I guess we can say that. So noise is terrible. You can reduce it. Everything's great. Near the end of this book, my favorite chapter was like right near the end, which talks about the difference between rules and standards, which seems, I don't know quite how it all tied into the rest of this book, but it was great. We have this sort of love-hate relationship with both rules and standards. Rules, there's no discretion. Like they should be yes or no. And so rules theoretically have very little noise as part of the system. Either this happened or it didn't happen. Either you were going over the speed limit or you were not. It's a sort of a yes or no. There should be no discussion, but also sort of limit the power of the role of judgment, the rule of judges versus standards. So a rule is a speed limit sign, right? It tells you exactly what it is. Here it is. Follow the speed limit. A standard is something a little more open to discussion, to discretion, and it might be a little more vague, like drive safely. What does that mean? Drive a safe speed. That would be a standard for driving versus right here, you're going to drive 25 miles per hour. That's a rule for driving, right? So rules versus standards. We tend to love standards for some things because it gives the decision maker, the judge, essentially, a lot of power. They can really, engage in their sort of thought process. They feel this sense of like, oh, I made a good judgment. They feel a sense of validation from deciding at the end. All great. Also super duper noisy, right? How do I know if someone's driving safely for the conditions, whatever that means? I don't know. Did they crash or not? I guess it was safe. Did they run people off the road? Probably not safe. But so that's where standards don't really fit in. Also, someone could be going the right speed limit and still drive like a maniac in other ways. And it might not be safe regardless. So we have rules, we have standards. And I think the key that they wanted to get to was that it's good to decide when we're using which. Like, when do we want to reduce the role of judgment by having a rule, which might reduce noise, but also when do we want to have standards where judges can be specific and they can really interpret meaning, because we want this feeling of engagement and that we're people and we're treated uniquely. And so this gets back around to this reason of why we actually have noise. But noise is something we want sometimes in systems. We don't want every case to be judged only by a robot. They talked about algorithms, by the way, a little bit. So algorithms also can reduce noise, potentially, can reduce bias, theoretically, also. And so an algorithm is basically a machine, a computer that will make the decision for us. We put in the factors, it spits out the decision. And there are plenty of cases where this is happening. If you give, one example they talked about was reading radiology, reading x-rays, essentially, and radiology reports. You can have a human look at it and be like, oh yeah, well this isn't indicated for, whatever condition I thought I was looking for. A computer, essentially, go through the same data, the same report, look at the same x-ray and be like, this does indicate this because of, whatever factors it was trained with. So there is a potential to train your algorithms poorly, and then you get biased judgments in the end. You still don't get very noisy judgments, but you can train bias in, and that's the concern people have. But in reality, if you train in bias, you're doing a terrible job of building an algorithm. So algorithms may be a solution, but I don't think most of us would love a computer to grade our papers. We don't love it when computers grade resumes going into jobs necessarily, because then people just throw in a million keywords and it looks super terrible. But yet those people, because they have enough keywords, the computer reads them and moves them forward, right? We already have this happening in weird, strange ways in our world. So we have rules, we have standards, we have ways to avoid, we have decision hygiene that should help us out. We have noise, which is this huge distribution of judgments around the same type of thing. We have bias, which can also skew the average judgment that we're trying to reach. This is what this whole book is about. I'm super excited, obviously, about it. And I hope you read it. And if you're thinking now, what does this have to do with my life? I think you're going to see more and more as people realize how pervasive the problem of judgment is. Trying to reduce this noise is going to give you better judgments in the end. It's going to give you more accuracy, less errors, you're going to be more effective to reduce noise. And noise is statistical. It's not that exciting. It's not super fun to be like, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have an interview process that is not this conversational chit-chatty interview, which is rife with bias and crazy, like it enhances bias and it is open to huge amounts of noise if we have a conversational interview versus a structured interview where we're only going to ask the same questions of the same people and rate them based on this scale we all have. We're going to understand what a rating of 4 means versus a rating of 5 versus a rating of 6 before we even talk. We're going to judge each candidate individually and then share and aggregate our ratings and share them together. We're going to maybe average those out, even our ratings, to try to get the true estimation of what the person's longevity with the business again. And people hate those interviews, by the way. I don't know if you know anyone who's gone through an interview process recently where it's like you're talking to, they ask you a question, you answer the question, there's no follow-up or chit-chat. They ask the next question, you answer the next question. And all the interviewers are just sort of rating and not really interacting in as human as a way as compared to the more chit-chatty conversational interview that flows all over the place. Delaying your use of intuition until later in the process, also super helpful and beneficial for reducing noise within a system. Also, I think some of these same practices will reduce bias in some systems too, but fixing noise is a much bigger problem than fixing psychological biases within a system. There is still huge arguments to be made for addressing sort of this social bias that's out there in the world. Obviously, hugely problematic. Psychological biases, also hugely problematic. But noise still, unless it's a standard deviation away, and I suspect, by the way, there are places where bias is a standard deviation from the average of the bell curve. So this is not like this doesn't ever happen. It is more rare that it happens, but noise is still a bigger problem statistically. Not exciting to have statistical problems, yet we can solve them with statistics. So to wrap up, where does this all leave you? What do you do now? How is this going to make your life better? This is going to make your life better because if if you're like me, suddenly your brain is thinking a lot about standards versus rules and how to set up systems so that people are treated fairly, treated equitably, treated well within a system. So that's where my brain goes for part of this. The other part is, how do we reduce noise? How do we have multiple people in a group, in an organization, deciding on how to respond to a challenge, or how to respond to a problem, how to sanction someone, should we deliver a punishment? What course of action should we take? We get these huge, messy, noisy conversations that happen. How do we make them more clear, more direct, and more focused? Which essentially means, how do we get better decisions? How do we reduce error? How do we move forward more effectively? And it's not going to feel like more efficiently, but being more effective over time, I think will make you more efficient. If you don't need to rehire someone new every 2 years, if people are actually there for 5 years, you're just going to be that much more efficient and effective within your organization. If you need people to be around for 5 years to really be doing a good job at their job, for whatever reason that is. So anyway, I invite you to read this book. I feel like at times you can tell when the different people are writing different chapters. I definitely cheered for some of them when they're like, oh, I know who's writing this part because it's about biases, or it's about influencing behavior. It's about psychological bias that comes into our lives, about different things. It's great. It's based on research. These folks have been around a long time doing this type of work. The math is not that hard. I maybe explained it not super awesomely. You get the picture. Bell curves. The reason that there is a bell curve is noise. If you're expert judges judging on the same facts, there shouldn't be a bell curve, because there's noise in the system. Fixing that fixes so many different things. And you, as an individual, as a person, you're like, cool, I don't make judgments, I don't look whatever. You have occasion noise and you have pattern noise within your own system and the decisions and choices that you're making. Reducing those will increase your, efficiency as a human. It's a weird thing to say. Will free you up, though. If you might not love and increasing your efficiency as a human, but you might love the idea of having more energy, more time to do other things. It might make your life, it might give you energy, free up energy from trying to repeat things, keep learning the same lesson over and over again. It might move you forward with more energy to do other things you want to do, free you from the sense of having to make decisions and then having to remake the same decision because your decision was an error. I mean, errors look like so many different things in our lives. So reduce the noise in your own personal decision-making. Good luck with that. Use some decision hygiene. Think well. Understand your patterns. Understand your behavior. Reduce your bias also. That's probably going to help you out by making better decisions with less error, move you toward where you want to go a little more effectively. And I think we're all going to be a little bit happier out there. I hope you enjoyed listening to me very excitedly talk about this book. I really actually enjoyed it a ton. And we can do better. We can make better judgments. And I think that'll make our world a better place. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.